get the seats filled as quickly as possible so we can have an engaging discussion. Let me first invite up to the stage Aoun Al-Hassouneh, who is a former judge at the International Court of Justice and a former Prime Minister of Jordan. You're going to be sitting right over here because we have to line up with those, you see. There you are. Here's your microphone. Some water, please. We have one active current member of the United Nations, and I don't want this to be a panel where we gang up on her. We're going to be as fair and robust as possible. Gui Yup Son has worked for many departments at the UN, UN OCHA, UNDP, now UNDCO, is the regional director for Europe and Central Asia. Ma'am, thank you very much. You'll be seated over here. Our next panelist is someone who has had scathing criticism of the United Nations. And for good reason. He was on the inside and saw things and experienced things that he did not like very much over the years, particularly during the period of the build-up to the Iraq War and its aftermath, the former UN Assistant Secretary General Hans von Sponeck. No problem. Sit down. And finally, our final panelist, Dr. Jorge Castañeda, the former Foreign Minister of Mexico, and is a professor at NYU. Looking forward to it. See. So, just so you all know, your microphones, try to get them as close to your mouths as possible when you do speak. I'm going to ask our colleagues to keep everybody's microphones live throughout the discussion so that we can have a chat with each other. As I said yesterday, my job is to try to stay out of the way as often as possible. I would really appreciate it if you all interacted with each other, responded to each other, even asked questions of each other. However, to begin, I'm going to start with one question for each one of you as we go along the panel, and it's going to be a very simple question. And let me start with the Honorable Justice closest to me. Is the UN still fit for purpose?
Well, let me start by quoting 16th century Spanish picaresque novelist Lázaro de Tormes, who said certain things are so obvious that they tend to fall into oblivion. I feel that I should start by quoting this because there is a tendency now to bash the United Nations, but we forget that the United Nations is merely, as it was said yesterday aptly, is merely a mirror of the world. So we bash the United Nations, we say all sorts of things about it, but in fact, the United Nations doesn't have a life of its own. When we bash the United Nations, what we mean, in effect, is the fact that the main bodies of the United Nations have the Security Council, to some extent even the General Assembly and other bodies, have not been able to fulfill their work efficiently, due basically to the pressure that has been brought on them by one or two states, and in the case of Palestine in general, case of Gaza, by the actions of the United States and to some extent by the United Kingdom. I would even go further and say that in my experience, apart from the International Court of Justice, of which I was a member, and I'm referring to the advisory opinion. I don't think the case of Palestine received, and the people of Palestine received throughout the years a fair treatment by the main political bodies of the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations is much larger than this, and no one will deny that it is doing a good work. To what extent, I really don't know. I remember when I first went to the UN as a young and diplomat, green in judgment, there was a committee called the Committee on Information, which used to measure the effectiveness of the United Nations. So they would say awareness of the United Nations has increased by 35% in Uttar Pradesh in India, but went down by 5% in Costa Rica, and so on and so forth. It is beyond me to say whether this is accurate, and certainly will take a long time to do so. So it's basically in the area of the political bodies, and including, I think, the General Assembly recently, that one is tempted, although you warned us against it, to bring the image of what happened to the League of Nations, but I will mention it nevertheless.
Yeah, I mean, a different way for me to phrase the question in a more harsh way would be, should the UN suffer the same fate as the League of Nations? The good news is that something else came afterwards, so who knows? But as you say, it's a mirror of us. So the implication then, don't fix your mirror, fix your face.
Right.
Gui Son, you work on the inside. Not only do you see the good work that's been done, you've been involved in the good work. You've had a stellar career in Somalia and in Afghanistan, in many countries, difficult places where politicians make decisions that affect the lives of millions of people, and UN workers and their departments do their very best to ensure that people still have a dignified life. With that in mind, and in light of all the other criticism, is the UN still fit for purpose, ma'am?
Thank you. I think there are two parts to that answer. One is, as our Secretary General has been very clear in the opening speech of the General Assembly this year, that the global governance architecture of the United Nations, as well as the Bretton Woods, they are outdated. And they definitely need a reform to be in line with the change the world that we live in now. So I think there is a lot of efforts to actually reform the United Nations. And there are specific proposals, including Security Council and General Assembly, and these discussions are taking place, and they will be presented by the member states as a part of the intergovernmental process as in the summit for the future. So that's kind of one. We are talking about exactly what the previous panelists mentioned about the UN being the mirror of the member states, fragmented, divided, polarized. I think this is what we are seeing, and hence the reason why the Secretary General invoked Article 99 and submitted this letter to the Security Council. I think we all know what is taking place, and there's an urgency to save lives and the livelihoods of many innocent victims. So the second part of my response to your question is that, yes, there are a huge amount of work that is being done by the United Nations staff members. They are at the forefront and the frontier of humanitarian response. And this is one of the reasons why the SG has invoked Article 99, asking for humanitarian ceasefire so that we can deliver humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable, to those that are in need. And we need to protect the humanitarian aid workers, because if we don't, we can't really deliver. In line with the international humanitarian law and human rights law, we have to protect hospitals where lives are being saved, and we are also to protect humanitarian aid workers. So the United Nations will continue, regardless what the resolution says and does and is, we will continue to work to reduce the vulnerabilities of people and to reduce human suffering. And that's what we do, and we will continue to do that regardless what the resolutions are.
Thank you, ma'am. Hans von Sponeck, I think I know where you stand on this issue. Tell us what your major gripe with the UN is, and you're not just anybody, you're somebody who's the former Assistant Secretary General. You were involved, as it says on top there, you were the UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq. Full disclosure, Dr. von Sponeck shared something with me before the panel. He wrote something, and I read it, and this is me perhaps doing a bit of a psychological reading of it. There was an element of almost guilt or shame at the helplessness you felt you had in a senior position at the UN during the time of sanctions and war and so on with Iraq. There's a lot of heavy emotion related to it, i.e. good intentions, but a sense of betrayal that the system was not designed to be able to truly make a difference in the major ways that you wanted it to make a difference. Is the UN still fit for purpose, sir?
Well, I would say...
Just gonna twist it up there. There we go.
Obviously there's no easy answer to this. But after 32 years in an organization in which today, now, I still deeply believe, I can say, I cannot answer the question, is the UN fit for purpose? But what I can do is answer the question, once we define which UN do I mean. The UN has many faces. There is the political face, the General Assembly, the Security Council. There's the judicial phase, the International Court of Justice. And there's the executive phase, in which I was 30 out of the 32 years involved. That consists of the Secretary General and his team of specialized agencies, funds, and programs. And the reform challenges, and we are here to discuss what options do we have to make this United Nations more effective. 3 completely different answers. The reform challenge for the executive is totally different from the reform challenge which should, with you here, us here, maybe is the most important element, is obviously the political, the Security Council. What Imran Bey has referred to yesterday, the Security Council voting on Gaza, was in my many years of watching the UN since I left the UN, was incredible. I was grateful to TRT that I could see the entire voting process, and I was ashamed that in the building that houses an institution that has, Imran, done much better than the predecessor, the League of Nations, we could have a situation where, for political purposes, we are sacrificing the lives of innocent people, whether they live on this side of the border or mainly on the other side, on the Gaza border. That was shameful. I want to, if I may have another moment.
Sure, go for it.
I just want to say, yeah, in 1945, ladies and gentlemen, there was a dream of 3 old men Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. That dream included a promise to work together as a team for that newly developing organization called United Nations. But if I make a big jump 78 years later, this United Nations is no longer reflective of a dream. It has become a nightmare. And the Cold War that is alleged to have ended in 1990, this is nonsense. The Cold War has continued, with the difference that today that war is much colder than it was before. I just want to very quickly, if I have another minute or so, I just want to say, and some of us may not like this, but the evidence is there. I'm not expressing an opinion. I'm expressing a fact that the United Nations that evolved in all these years has become a very West-centric institution. Now, there are indications of what I'm saying. Where is the political UN located? In New York. Where is the commercial and financial, not commercial, the economic and financial policy work done? Well, it's done by 2 UN. Many of us don't know that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are 2 United Nations agencies. So the policy in those 2 areas is made in Washington. Practically without any exception, the operational UN, the executive UN, is located where? It's located in Western Europe and in North America. And out of 5 permanent members, 3 come from the West. That has had an impact on the direction in which the United Nations moved. And it is this which I hope, Imran Bey, we can discuss a little bit. What are the implications of that West-centric orientation? And I would say it fits, because whether the West likes it or not, the world is in a speedy, increasingly speedy process of what? Of de-Westernization. And in saying that, I want to be optimistic, because I hope that because of that trend, which has nothing to do with the General Assembly, the Security Council, has something to do with how the populations globally react, that because of this shift, that geopolitical shift, that we can enter into a debate about what needs to be done in order to create a more balanced political structure, and last word, in order to, sounds very aggressive, I don't want to be aggressive, in order to liberate the United Nations, to make it free, to make it independent as a body from geopolitical preferences. I have much to say on reform possibilities. I will stop here, and I'm sorry I was a bit long.
That's fine. Thank you. To the point of it being Western-centric, it appears that my question would elicit different answers depending on which foreign ministers or foreign secretaries I ask. So if I ask the US Secretary of State if the UN is fit for purpose, they'd have a certain answer. If I'd ask the Mexican foreign minister, they'd have another. If I ask the Somali foreign minister, there'd be another, and so on and so forth. Jorge Castañeda, as the former foreign minister of Mexico, I wonder where you saw yourself in relation to the UN and where the UN saw you. And I wonder, in light of that, do you believe that the UN is still fit for purpose?
Well, you could start perhaps by repeating the old saying that if the United Nations didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And I think that that is really sums up the paradox that has been underlined by my three colleagues. It does a series of things that are indispensable and that somebody has to do. How does it do them? It does them the way the member states allow it to do them. And you were absolutely right when you mentioned before, not all member states, unfortunately, despite the charter, are the same in the sense that they do not have the same influence, starting, of course, with the P5, but even the ones who are not members of the P5, but who contribute much more than other members. But it does things, we tend to lose sight of this, and I would like to, it does stuff that is very important for the world, for regions like Latin America, but many others also. UNHCR is, for example, even today, in Mexico, is doing more than practically anybody else, or the OIM now, which is a UN agency, doing more than anyone else, certainly more than the Mexican or the American governments, in dealing with hundreds of thousands of migrants who are stuck in Mexico, waiting to enter the United States. Perhaps they never will.
But those member states are the arsonist and the fireman. That's the problem. And so the UN gets involved when you're putting out the fire, but
the fire starts on its own. Yes, but it does do this work. The Human Rights Council and the High Commissioner, with all the imperfections, with all the impotence, with all the difficulties it has had over the years in finding the right voice, nonetheless is the most important human rights instance in the world today. It is far from perfect, it's highly imperfect. But what would we do without it? Would we prefer for it not to exist?
Well, some would. Some would say, well, you had a country that executes people for protesting, heading the Human Rights Council. What a joke. I mean, these are
no, and they're right when they say that.
Yeah.
So the question then is the solution to do away with this or to change it in one direction or another? And there we have this problem, and that's where a country like Mexico comes in. You know, the new global south. Well, I understand the logic of it for many countries and the need, the importance of transforming not only the UN, but the IMF, the World Bank, and other institutions to take into account a new correlation of forces of economic strength in the world, the demographic, economic, trade, etc. Yes, I understand that full well. What do you do with a place like Mexico? And there are many places like us. Are we part of the new global south? Are we the poor neighbors of the global north? Should we aspire to Security Council permanent member status? Would others want us to be there, really? And I could say the same for many of the aspiring members, those who do want permanent member status. I'm not sure if I were in the job today whether I would necessarily want some of the candidates, some of the P4, to actually be permanent members.
Yeah, you said if the United Nations did not exist, we would have to invent it. If the United Nations Security Council did not exist and we had to invent it in the year 2023 with the veto powers for the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France, I know nothing about anything, but I would bet that the vast majority of people on Earth would be against it.
I agree with you completely.
So
it wouldn't,
doesn't that tell you where the problem is?
We wouldn't have a Security
No,
Council.
I mean, there's no question we cannot possibly have a Security Council of 1945 to overseeing multilateral policy in 2023. It's ridiculous.
And is that the thing? Is it the 1945 born out of a world war?
Look,
Is that the issue? Is that
No,
we're still
the-
following a template from then?
No, the issue is that the UN has not adapted to change. The world looks very different today. Why would Germany, Brazil, Japan, and South Africa or whatever, in India, have a claim on the permanent seats? The fact is, Africa isn't represented at all in the permanent group. Latin America is not at all represented in this permanent group. Asia, with over 50% of the population, has 1 seat, and the Western world has 3 seats. That's no longer a platform on which we can do international geopolitical politics. It's not possible. So the first reform challenge is to change that, to make it a more balanced representation, slightly enlarged. I know details. There are many ideas on how to handle that. There are many ideas on how to handle the procedures in the Security Council, ranging from abolishing the veto, having a 2/3 majority, having which is a very fascinating idea, by the way, instead of having a national representation on the Security Council, to have regions represented.
Right. I just want to bring Ms. Son in, and it's interesting because I think that veto, especially last night, really stings for so many people, because as Jorge Castañeda mentioned to me as well, before we came in, even if the UK didn't abstain, I mean, it was 15 out of 15, 14 members, and just one, the United States has to say veto, and this thing doesn't work, right? Ms. Son, you want to come in?
Yeah, because I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of these discussions about making the United Nations fit for purpose as we speak. The member states have asked the Secretary General to actually present some ideas and recommendations. In response to that, he presented a report called Our Common Agenda. And it lists a number of recommendations, and this will be negotiated by the member states in the Summit of the Future in 2024, next summer, next General Assembly session. Now, what the discussions are taking place, example of a Security Council, is that, that in line with the changed world, that the membership of the Security Council needs to be much more inclusive, and that it needs to include a more diversified membership, and that the veto power needs to be looked at. Should it be in line with the new Security Council membership, or should it be actually consensus-based? And there's also a recommendation on General Assembly that it should be there should be a shift from non-binding resolutions to binding resolutions, with the accountability of Security Council and other organs of the United Nations. These discussions are taking place now, actually, right, as we speak.
And that's good. That is good that they are. If you look up here with Aoun el-Khassone, it says former Prime Minister, Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The job you resigned from in order to take up the prime ministership was as a judge at the International Court of Justice. As the judge, you've had 20 minutes to listen to everybody. I want you to pass judgment now. You've had enough opportunity to listen. Which is the pessimistic approach still the prevailing one about the UN and its current structures? Or is it enough, as we hear from Ms. Son, that there are these discussions for reform? Give them a chance.
Well, I unfortunately belong to the pessimistic group. I think it's relatively easy to think about possible formulas for reform. The possibilities are endless, basically. But we tend to forget that the international system is a system of power. It's not an academic system. And I have witnessed examples, for example, in the elaboration of the Rome Statute and elsewhere, to bring more power power to judicial bodies, even in the topic of state responsibility under Gaetano Aranjo Ruiz, who in my opinion was one of the best international lawyers in the world. When it came to the question of international peace and security, all his proposals were rejected. Let's talk about Human Rights Council. At the age of 32, I was a member of the subcommission on the protection of minorities and the prevention of discrimination. And like many members of my generation, I was imbued with the promises that international law, the great civilizer of nations, will have the potential for settling issues and so on and so forth. And there were books talking about beyond the charter, even something beyond the charter. But already you could see the cracks. When I went to the United Nations in 1975, I read almost everything that had been said in the Security Council. And on the 25th anniversary in 1972, an African diplomat quoted the following lines from Alfred Lord Tennyson. What I should be like at 50, should nature keep me alive, if the world looks so bitter when I'm but 25. Now, the United Nations is beyond 50, and we know exactly how it would look like. The promises of international law, of international society, have been frustrated. There's no doubt about it, and no amount of talk about reform is likely to succeed. I say this, and I wish that I am wrong, but I am not persuaded by the other argument. I say this today.
I just want to, just a bit of housekeeping. I see a clock there that's timing me out here. I'm going to ask for 5 more minutes, please, just so we can continue with the discussion. You know, Hans von Sponeck, again to the point of the UN being a mirror. I've traveled to places where someone like Madeleine Albright, who you have criticized, is reviled as US Secretary of State, especially during the years of sanctions against Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, in the years building up to the Iraq War, which you opposed. I've also traveled to places where they name streets after her, in Bosnia and Kosovo, because of the US and the UN's role. And I wonder, ultimately, and this is a horrible thought sometimes, is it relative to who you ask in a specific context, in a specific time, in a specific conflict?
Well, if you hang around your own kind, as a politician, for example, you hear maybe similar voices. But there's a new voice around. And some of those members of the new voice sit right here, the young people, the people who want to do it better than my generation did it. And I firmly believe that all the reform debate, academic or political, will in the future, or must in the future, include civil society. If there's a glimmer of hope, I'm more optimistic than my honorable colleague here. If I look into the mirror, I see myself with a small smile, because I believe that in partnership, the world is bigger than 5. Yes, the world is bigger than 5. But the world is bigger than 5 governments, because there's a new power on the block. And that new power is us, the people, civil society. That's not being naive. That's a fact. Look at what happens in COP. Look at what happens in the big conferences. look forward to what is happening next
If you'd
September.
allow me to interject here, because a lot of civil society thinks that we've moved beyond the medieval nature of war, so we start to debate aspects of how is AI going to affect our lives? How are we going to deal with climate change? How are we going to prevent other pandemics? And then they turn on the TVs and they see neighborhoods being barrel bombed and civilians being gutted. And they think, well, what's going on with our world? And isn't that part of the paradox? You have people dreaming, but the reality is we're still unable to prevent grotesque mass murder.
Only one sentence here. There's a great saying, I believe in it. Look to the stars, have a vision, but keep your feet on the ground. That is my message.
Okay. I want to run through the panel from the far end and then coming back closer to me with concluding comments from everybody. Please, Jorge Castaneda, go ahead.
Yes, I must say I'm as pessimistic as my colleague from Jordan is. I do not believe really much in United Nations, at least Security Council reform. I cannot imagine a situation where the 5 permanent members who have to approve any change in the rules would approve a change that would give them less power or give their power to others. I do not see that happening in any reasonable amount of time. So the question is, what can we do with the existing situation? I would love to have things change through the power of civil society or the new global south or other factors, but I do not see that happening. And secondly, I would like to be sure that instead, for example, of necessarily universalizing instances like the Human Rights Council with all its defects, I wouldn't like necessarily to have it endorse values that are different from the ones it endorses now. I don't like a lot of what it does.
And that's another panel almost, but it's interesting.
I'm willing to say so
Right.
Openly.
Yeah.
I would rather it endorse many of the values that are in the Universal Human Rights Declaration of 1945 than to find a new interpretation of human rights, which frankly I at least would not agree with.
Okay, we'll put a pin in that and maybe use it as inspiration for a panel next year or further forward. It's a brilliant thought. Hans von Sponeck, final concluding comments from you, sir.
I've talked enough. I pass on.
Ms. Son.
I feel, just having listened to the panelists, that it's all the UN that you are making a lot of references to. But we have to hope for the new UN that reinvigorates multilateralism, that is much more networked and inclusive. Yes, perhaps it's an aspiration, but without that ambition and vision, we are not going to get there. And if we are putting the people in the center of everything that we do, the voice that you represent plays a key part in making these changes of the United Nations system and the multilateralism.
Thank you. Aoun El-Khassani.
Yeah, it's not a question of what we like or don't like. Of course, everybody would like peace to be prevalent and justice done. But I think more importantly, I think we should be reading our times correctly. I love quotations, and I will quote Ash-Sha'rani, who was a 15th century Egyptian jurist, and who said, "The wisest of men are those who can best interpret their times." And we live in times where, and this so often happens, and has happened in history, whenever there is a dominant group, whether within societies or internationally, and that group feels that its dominance is being undermined or will be undermined, that is the most likely moment when that group will commit big crimes, will take actions that are so shocking, because what is at issue here is fear. And fear is a powerful instinct. And I think we are living in that moment in history. So that's what is always on my mind and what is bothering me. And I can only pray that we will get out of this situation with as little damage, not only to human life, which is very precious, but also to the values and the promises of international law and international justice.
The wisest of men are those who best interpret their times. Sharan, 15th century. And we've got Tennyson as well. Before we began, you gave me some insight into my family's history from the 17th century. Beautiful. This has been an education. The judge has spoken. Everybody has spoken. I thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.